Hi, this is Chris Hoy. I want to thank you for joining me on today's Create with Chris. I will be painting this high-rise honeycomb, sharing my simple tips, tricks, and techniques. Starting out with a 12 by 4 MDF plaque, a little bit of sealer and raw sienna, mixing it with my brush as I paint it on. This is going to provide a good base coat as well as sealing the surface. So it's kind of like taking care of two things at once. Putting on a nice, smooth, even coat. It's not super heavy, but its main purpose is to just give a good base and seal that wood. Make sure that it is completely dry. I'm going to hit it with my heat tool to get that extra moisture out of there so it is ready to start with that good base coat. I also did give it a quick sand with very fine grit sandpaper just to remove any roughness that might still be there. Loading my oval wash with blue mist, and I'm also squirting out a little puddle of spa blue, doing a slip slap stroke. And I'm using the flat of my brush, going from side to side, almost like an X stroke. The main purpose is to cover it quickly with thinned paint. I do have a fair amount of moisture in my brush. It will be light and dark. You can see brush strokes, but I'm looking for just a soft light and dark. It's going to take several layers. Excuse me. So I'm not going to be able to achieve the look I want with one coat. Now I was going to take this out because the paint, I didn't shake it well and it was so thin that I had no saturation at all. So make sure you have your paint mixed well or you'll just get that real thin color and that's not going to work. So this is foliage green. I worked a little bit of it in with my dirty brush. It had a little bit of spa blue on it. Doing that same slip slap. Now it's a little bit too green. So I picked up some of that raw sienna and just worked it into that color as well. I added just a little touch of that foliage green up in the top right corner, just to bring a little reflection back up there. And I'm toggling back and forth between blue mist and spa blue. And you can see how it's starting to blend that background together and just give it a real soft movement back there. Picking up more spa blue as I work towards the bottom, a little bit of foliage green and a little bit of raw sienna down towards the bottom for more of an earthy tone. Just going back over, and I am using DecoArt Americana colors and they'll be listed below. All of the product that I am using is available at Cupboard Distributing, www.cdwood.com. And just going back and now pulling this up a little bit on the chisel edge of my brush, kind of replicates the look of foliage or grass growing in the background. And I am giving this, making sure that it is dry between applications because I don't want to, if the paint has started to dry and you're adding another layer, you're probably going to lift the prior layer off and that's going to leave a bare spot or kind of a hole. Now this is my third coat and it's just a very light, very quick. Each application is just going on very lightly and they build that depth and it just looks kind of filmy in the background. That's exactly what we're going for. Wanted to give a little more interest. I love this mishmash stencil and I am using spa blue on my spectacular stencil brush. And this is a line of stencil brushes that I designed. Very, very soft bristle. You don't use any water with the stencil application. Just get a little bit of paint on your brush. Wipe it on a paper towel to get rid of excess moisture. Now I am mostly using spa blue, but as I go towards the bottom, I can kind of blend into that blue mist. You're just looking for contrast. So kind of take a peek at the background and see if it's going to show up enough. This is just a quiet design. It doesn't require a super strong, intense design. It's just back there to kind of break that background up and soften it up a little bit more. I'm using a dirty brush. I don't clean it out. But one thing nice about my stencil brushes, if you do need to go to a different color, you just clean it out in your water basin, towel dry it, and it's ready for that next color. I'm using the stencil randomly, which means I didn't just put it on and stencil the entire thing. Move it around and pick the design you want and kind of add to that area, because this is a combination of designs and doesn't require anything specific. You can pick and choose. You just want to fill that background in. Make sure it's covered completely. And I did add a little, I like those music notes. I think that looks kind of lyrical. And this does create a movement in the background. So in addition to that kind of flowy background, having this little bit of design is a beautiful background that can be used for almost any design. Take a look at it. You can see whether or not you like the way it looks or whether you need more. So it's not finished until you decide that it is finished. And I think that looks pretty good. Now I know I want to add just a little more to the background. And what I'm doing next, I'm using my palette knife and charcoal gray. And this is a very interesting technique. And I'm just spreading the paint flatly on the base or on the back side of my palette knife and just kind of sliding it across the surface. It doesn't leave much, and you don't want it to leave a lot. It just kind of gives that distressed look. It's a super simple technique to add. Very impressive results. And it's almost like spreading peanut butter as far as how you slide it on. But the secret is to just have a whisper of paint on the bottom of the palette knife. I like it to be a little bit darker and stronger towards the bottom, maybe around the corners. Very easy to control how much is added. And just take a look at it to see if you're happy with it. You can add more or less, whatever your preference is at this point. This has been dried, and I am adding a little bit of plantation pine. I'm going to float it down the left side, across the bottom, and up the right side. To give a little more interest, I'll have the left side just a little bit, I float it just a little bit taller than the right side. It just makes it not super balanced. I did base coat the beehive in marigold, but it wasn't quite the right color. So I went back and base coated the beehive in yellow ochre. That marigold was just a little bit too strong and yellow. And I was going to edit that out, but I thought you would like to know my thought process. And it's often until you do it, you're not sure if it's going to work out. I'm using my 3/4 inch oval wash. I love the rounded end on the brush. It just makes it so easy to create those sections of the beehive just with the brush, just to follow those curves. And this is a little bit on the whimsical side, so I'm not too fussy if it's not perfect. I just want that beehive look. So I'm just kind of going down, putting that little curve, trying to balance it out on both sides. And again, this is just the first coat, so I can straighten it up a little more. I did put it on vertically, and then I went across horizontally to smooth out any strokes that might still be visible. Now, the beehive's no different than everything else we're doing. Just a simple application of several layers of paint to create that look. So I never paint heavily. I have raw sienna loaded on the toe of my 1/2 inch angle and just kind of floating that across the bottom and up the right side of each one of those sections at this point. And you can see that it's a very light wash. If your paint is dragging, if your brush is not flowing well, you have too much water. If you get too much paint like I just did, just grab a little more water and float it out. Now, this is not perfect at this point either. I'm just wanting to get those sections divided up and kind of build the bones of the structure. And again, it's just on the bottom and up that right side. Now my light source is coming from the top left, so the right side's going to be a little bit stronger. But I am still going to add a little bit of shading on the left. But before I do that, I wanted to give it a quick dry so that I'm not going to get into any of that previous paint and move it around. I don't have to be quite as careful. And with this float of raw sienna, I would say it's probably balanced as far as intensity compared to the right and left side. Again, this is just the first layer of shading we're going to put on there. And it all builds together beautifully. Mostly a lot of water. Make sure that paint just flows on. It's always so much easier to go back and add more paint as opposed to trying to remove some of it. Now I've loaded my spectacular stencil with raw sienna, and I'm using a very, very light kind of a circular dry brush. And I'm adding that honeycomb design, and you can see it's not solid and it's not perfect. I just want to give that indication that there are little honeycomb sections in there. Just that quick. I'm not fussy or particular. Give it another quick dry with my heated tool, and I do dry often. Between layers, it makes it much easier to add the paint. I decided to deepen that shading. I'm using light cinnamon, and this is just mostly to add a little more depth to the shading, kind of richen that shading color up just a little bit. And it's kind of a next step between the raw sienna, and then we're going to add charcoal gray on there as well. So this is kind of the medium shading between that. Warms it up a good bit. And I'll just float that on the bottom side and up the right side. And decided not to go down the left side on that. And then I looked at it and thought maybe I needed a little more, mostly down towards the bottom. And you can tell if yours is super light, this is a good way to go back and just enhance those lines very quietly. A lot of water. You can see how much moisture I have on my brush. Picked up a little bit of Snow White in that yellow ochre, and I'm going to float highlights, mostly on the top and the left side. And I'm using my angle brush, but you could also dry brush these on. And I kind of do a little bit of both, but because the color is very thin, when it dries, it's going to be much lighter than what it appears to be right now. And I can go back and add more if I need to. Always remember, a little bit light-handed, you're going to be safe with it. I'm using my spectacular stencil brush, and I did go back and dry brush with that mix of Snow White and yellow ochre. And once you put the highlights on, sometimes they may appear a little bit bright, but we don't have our shading in there to really tone that down, and that's what's going to balance it out. I'm using pure Snow White, but it's thinned down, and most of the brightness is going to be on the top and the left side. And they don't have to be perfectly equal. And I can always go back and add more. Just a little bit on that right side just to brighten that up as well. I'm going back into charcoal gray. And my beehive's just a little bit wonky, so this is where I can go in and fine tune those edges. Take a little more time, straighten them up, give a nice crisp edge on it, and tidy up those bottom sections. This color, charcoal gray, is one of my favorite shading colors. It's not as intense as a black or a soft black. It has a very warm, shadowy color. It can be very dark. You thin it down. It can be just very transparent and beautiful. It goes well with just about every color. I usually toggle between charcoal gray and Payne's gray for my shadow colors. And see how that crisps up the edges and how much better that looks with just that simple float of that charcoal gray. And I'll do the same on the other side, but remember the light source is on the left side, so this side will be much more minimal in the float color. And I'm kind of focusing the bulk of the color more on the bottom of each section. And I can reshape any of those that I'm not real happy about. And also remember, we have all that clover that's going to be painted in there as well. What a huge difference that charcoal gray makes. I'm trying to decide where the hole needs to go. And I just kind of did a little wash to locate where I wanted it to be positioned. And I grabbed my circle stencil. I have a hard time with circles, so I use a stencil for all my circles. It just makes me look really good. I'm using charcoal gray and just going to stencil that in there. It's not super dark. I don't think I didn't want a really deep dark black hole. And you can kind of see that little ridge in there that goes behind it. Just going to kind of take a little bit of that charcoal gray and float around that hole so it doesn't look like it was stenciled on top, but actually is in the beehive. I did take a little bit of soft black and float on the left side of the hole as well. Now I'm repositioning that honeycomb stencil. I've loaded my stencil brush with a little bit of raw sienna, bringing back some of that stenciled look. And the highlights are going to be visible behind it, and they're going to glow through, but it just helps to add another dimension to it very, very easily. And you can see what a difference. It's going to tone down some of those highlights, but also it's going to accentuate that texture as well. Makes it not look so solid. And I think that looks perfect. I did trace on the flowers. You can see the oval shapes using the number 6 filbert base coating with light orchid, and just a couple little strokes. That's why I like the filbert so well. 1, 2, 3, and 4. So there's probably about 4 strokes for each one. And I kind of wanted them to be a little bulbier toward the bottom, so I went back and reshaped it. And the little buds are just basically 1 or 2 strokes. Trying to balance it out. I don't want my flowers to be like perfectly placed or, you know, spaced evenly. So I'm trying to just kind of be a little more random with those. Allow some of them to spill off over the edge. I always think that looks a little more interesting. Now I've loaded my 18-aught Epic script liner with plantation pine. Thin it down with water because you want to make sure that it's going to flow well. Every flower bud has to be attached to a stem, and it's going to look a little more natural if you have a lot of stems going on in the background instead of just one coming up. So make sure that they're connected so they all kind of flow well. And just add a few extra ones back there. I did add some extra little strokes at the bottom, kind of like a grass. Now this is an interesting technique. I have my 1/2-inch angle. The toe has light orchid on it, and the heel of the toe has plum on it. Now I stroked it on my palette so that I have a very sharp chisel edge, just touching it onto the surface and kind of fanning it out so that it creates a half and half, kind of a, I guess these are flower petals. Reload often, just a very, very light touch. If your brush starts to get muddled together, your colors are, you know, too mixed, you need to wash your brush and clean it. But again, it's light orchid on the toe. I like the angle because I can keep my hand at a comfortable position and just touch. Make sure that the brush chisel edge is always nice and flat. Don't overwork it too much. You're going to start to blend it all together. Just touch. Kind of pivots out from the middle of the flower. And the middle is not just one place. It's like from the base of the flower. Everything has to pivot out from that. Go ahead and just apply this first. Oh, I saw some places that once you get the hang of this, it's easy to go back and touch them up. But it's best to wait until they dry if you need to go back and touch it up. Load the brush. Wipe it on your palette to make sure that the chisel edge is nice and sharp, and just tap. Don't push. You just want to touch the brush on the surface to create that double stroke from light orchid, and it's going to blend down into that plum. Just touch. Now I do have the toe of the brush kind of goes past the edge of what our base coated flower was, so that I have the tips protruding from that base coated shape. Just touch, using the heel of my brush to create that rounded base of the flower. And I'm just stroking on the same place on my palette. That helps to Blend those colors softly together so you don't have a sharp divide between the two colors. You want it to be just gently blended and just touch, touch, touch. Now, this is not the final application of paint on these. So if you're not real happy about it, the way it looks right now, hang on, because we're going to add some more colors on there and some more layers. And it comes all together. Just touch, touch, touch. And you can do quite a few before you have to reload. You can tell when you start losing strength of color when you have to reload or when it becomes too fuzzy and blended. And you can see on my brush, I still have distinct light and dark, but that middle area where they meet is softly blended. And I just kind of fan out from that middle area, not from one pivot point, but from that middle area out, and then go back and add layers toward the bottom. Just a simple touch, touch, touch. And even though that's on the edge, I still go over the same as if it were all on that surface. And you can see how it protrudes past that edge, just enough to give that ruffled look. And I'm just using that one area on my palette to blend. Unless that becomes very muddied up, it's a perfect blending point. And you can see how I go over the edge just as if it were all there. Touch, touch, touch. I just think that it turned out, I was excited. I had not done this before with the clovers. I've done this for pine branches, and I thought, well, maybe it would work for the clover. And I was really pleased with how it turned out. Very, very simple to create this look, and I think it's very impressive. Now I am going in with a little bit of plantation pine before I do too much more on these flowers. And I could have done this earlier, but plantation pine is pretty transparent, and I just wanted it darker there at the base of the beehive. And I'm kind of giving it a choppy look. Pick up a little bit of charcoal gray in that to give more strength to it, and I did add a few little blades of grass. Now I've got my filbert. I'm loading it with plantation pine, and I just picked up just a touch on the corner of my brush, and I'm just pulling that around to create those the base of the clover. I think that's called this stamen, I believe. And I'm letting that bright, that spa blue be the highlight on the top edge. And if it doesn't come out perfect, that's okay. You can go back and reinforce those highlights. But if you can do this in one stroke, it just makes it so much easier. Just a teeny touch. And I'm not overstroking it, maybe 2 times, but I want that right below the clover flower. Create those little leaves, and then you need to have it a little thicker where it sits on the stem so that it looks like that one showed up pretty well. And I went ahead, it's dark down there, so I pulled some of that spa blue down to highlight that stem. And reload often. I think that's kind of the secret. If your brush gets muddy, clean it completely and reload. Plantation pine, touch of spa blue. Touch, touch, touch. Create that base and then pull that down. It doesn't have to be perfect and fussy, but if you're careful on how you apply it, it will work out just wonderfully. Now, the spa blue's in the sky area as well, so make sure that you keep that highlight right on the top. You don't want it to blend into the background or blend into the sky area. So make sure if you need to back off of that spa blue, and just go back there and highlight it later if I need to. See how that blends in? I just darken it with that plantation pine. It's all about contrast to make things show up well. They're not fussy leaves, they're not fussy petals. Everything is just kind of just very loosely added. And when I say loose, it doesn't mean you're not in good control of your brush. It just let the brush create that look. I had a little place, I went in with my little mono eraser and removed some of that excess paint. Now I'm going back with a little, just the spa blue. In those areas where it's super dark, I can brighten those up and really make them stand out. What a huge difference that makes. Now I am using a little bit of black plum, just going to put a touch of it on the toe of my brush, adding shadows around the base and kind of pulling it up a little bit. This is a choppy float because we don't want something smooth. All of these little sections of the clover, you want to not cover those up and make it look round. So I'm just kind of tapping that. I lost too much of my highlight there, so I'm adding a few back in. But you want to make sure that you still maintain that fluffy look, is that a good word, on those flowers. Just a little bit of paint, but wow, what a difference that little bit makes, just to deepen that in there. A lot of water, and I can always go back and add more, but I just want to make sure that that left side just has a little more strength to it and looks a little more shadowed, and there at the base of the flowers as well. I just think that looks fantastic. Now that we've added that shadow in there, I'm going in with a little bit of white, and I'm just highlighting. I just have a tiny bit on the tip of my brush. Keep that sharp chisel edge. Add just a few highlights in there, and it'll just brighten it up, mostly on the top and left side, but you can sprinkle just a couple on the right side here and there just to create that look of roundness. That really brightens it up. It's all these little touches that make a big difference. I always say a little bit of paint makes a big difference, and this is one instance where it just looks like somebody turned the light on. It just really brightens it up. They looked pretty good before, but once this white's on there, it just really starts to reflect the sunshine. That one just looks so good. Just make sure they're not lopsided. Now we need to add a few leaves. I'm loading my filbert with plantation pine. Again, I'm just going to pick up a bit of that spa blue, and I'm going to press, twist, and pull out to a point. And with that spa blue on there, it just automatically creates that little bit of shading that we need to shade it. Now on those on the left side that were right against the sky, I just backed off of the spa blue because they kind of disappeared. So pay attention to your background, create the leaves so that they contrast and that they're visible. They don't have to be real solid and dark, but you need to not have them disappear into the background either. Most clover leaves are in groups of 3. And if they don't show up well, we can always go back and add a little more highlighting on them or tone them down with some plantation pine. Didn't like the way that looked, so, you know, if you don't like it, take it off, do it again. And again. Down towards the bottom it gets a little bit tight, and even if you have a pattern to trace this on, still have to kind of pay attention to where the leaves are falling. You don't want it to be congested. And way I had it before, it just filled it in solid. Didn't like that look. As we get toward the bottom where it's darker, you can brighten it up a little bit more with that spa blue so that they stand out just a touch more. The leaves are a great, if you're not happy with the edge of your beehive, the leaves can kind of, maybe a good word is camouflage an area that's you're not real pleased with. And it helps to soften that whole design when you pull the leaves in around the beehive as well. And I always like it to go right over the edge, not to the edge. And that one was in the wrong place. So every time you put something on there, take a look at it. If you're not happy, it can be easily removed. I do use, it's matte, ultra matte varnish. If you want to put a coat of this on before you put your flowers and leaves on, it kind of creates a protective barrier which will allow you to easily remove any mistakes without digging into the background or the beehive. It's just kind of a little peace of mind. Take a look where there's empty areas, fill them in. Everybody does things a little bit different, so there may be different openings in different areas than my composition. Looking now for contrast to make sure they show up well, but and don't disappear in the background. Didn't want the bottom to look bare, so I do add a few more leaves down there as well. These were just a little bit dark, so I'm adding a little bit of highlight on there with Spa Blue. It just helps them to pop a little bit more. Again, I'm not being fussy. It's just kind of a touch of color. I'm using the filbert to kind of blend it in softly. Picking up a little bit of the Spa Blue on my Epic Script liner to add a few veins and connect them to the stems. Double load it with some plantation pine if you need more strength to it. Make sure everything's connected. Now I'm base coating the bee bodies with yellow ochre. And I'm using that same filbert. Everything here is kind of an oval round. And I think when you're painting rounded shapes, it just makes sense to use a rounded brush. It just makes it a little bit easier. And the bee bodies are like everything else. We just are going to be adding some layers of color on there. I did let it dry, going into raw sienna. Pick a little bit of that up on the toe of my angle brush. I'm using a 1/4 inch. Just going to float it along the bottom side of each of the bodies. I'm just going to darken that yellow down a little bit. Make sure that you have a lot of contrast between the bee on the beehive and the actual beehive itself. I am using soft black to paint the little stingers and my Epic script liner. And kind of making those a little bit longer and more exaggerated. It gives them a little more presence. The heads are a little half circle, so I'm going to be using my painter's pal to create the head. Pick the right size for the circle for the head. Using that little corner to kind of mask off the body. So I can load my Epic script or my Spectacular stencil with soft black. Going to see how that covers the body up. I'll leave that there. I'm going to lay the circle for the head on top of that stencil. And then when I lift it off, I have a perfectly round shaped head with a little oval on the body. Position that and stencil right over top. You can use 2 stencils together. They just work so perfectly. I have trouble with circles, so I find every way possible to create a circle without having to eyeball it because I want it to be perfect. This way I know it will be. And just like that, I have perfect heads on all 3. They're all identical sizes. They look fantastic. They sit well on the bodies, and it was super easy to create that. Using my Radical Round to paint the stripes, and these are soft black as well. Give them a little bit of a curve. It makes them look super rounded. And I always start in the middle and add those on there. And the reason I jumped to the top, I was afraid I'd get my hand in it before I got them all finished. That way I know too how they're spaced out. I want them all to be pretty close. I do turn my board a lot because everybody paints better in one direction than the other. And I want those edges to be a little fuzzy, so I'm kind of tapping my brush along each edge to just kind of fluff it up a little bit to make them look, I know they're not furry, but they do have a little bit of texture to them. And it's a little bit more in there. I I am just a touch of Snow White, and I want to put a little highlight on the head and pull some down over the bodies, and I do that at a little bit of a curve so they don't look flat. A little bit more soft black. And I'm using that and my Epic script liner. Thin it down so you have a nice flow. And I want to paint the antenna. And I make them a little bit wiggly. But that one looked like TV antenna, so I wasn't pleased with it. Wipe it off real quick. Create it again. If you're not happy with it now, I guarantee you're not going to be happy with it later. I like them a little bit wiggly. Makes them look a little whimsical. Pick up my stylus and add a little dip dot on each end of the antenna. Makes them stand out a little bit more, gives them a little more presence. I floated a little bit of soft plum around the outside edge in the sky, or just plum. And then I used my angle to float the wings Snow White. Not sure why that didn't tape, but I didn't have that. I loaded my Epic script liner with Snow White just to outline the wings and add a few little veins inside the wings and pulling them up into the wings. And I'll do that on each one. Let the front wings be a little bit stronger. The back wings kind of go in behind the front ones. Some bees have 2 sets of wings and some have 1. I decided to go with 2 on these. But if you wanted to just have 1 wing on each side instead of 2, I think that would look fine as well. I want the inside of the wing to be very filmy, but the outside edge needs to be nice and visible, especially with that light background sky. If you're enjoying my video today, be sure to give me a thumbs up and hit subscribe. That will help out a lot. Remember, all supplies are available and listed below. They're available at Cupboard Distributing, www.cdwood.com. If you want the pattern, e-pattern, or printed pattern, that is also available, which includes a color photo and line tracing. Just a little bit of soft black on the toe of my angle. I'm just going to strengthen that shadow along the base of their tummies. And also I'm going to float in between the wings just a little bit, just to help lift them and divide them. What a big difference a little bit of paint can make. One of my best painting tools is my finger. Picking up some charcoal gray. While that's drying, I want to paint just a little bit of a drop shadow below and to the right of any of the foliage that's on the beehive. And this is a dramatic effect. I love doing this. It's huge. It really lifts those flowers off the front of the beehive, gives a lot of depth and dimension. Just do everything, kind of replicate, doesn't have to be identical. You just need to know that shadow is there. Big difference. And any of the areas that might be dark, just tap a little bit of a shadow in there. I'm going to do the leaves that are on the right side as well. Just a little bit. That's going to bump them out as well. It's one of my favorite touches because it adds, it's really impressive. It adds so much drama. Make sure that paint's thin. You want a transparent shadow. You don't want it to be a heavy painted solid shape. See how that bee looks like he's flying now in front of that beehive? Just amazing. And we are almost to the end. Floating just a little bit of that charcoal gray in the bottom corners and across the bottom, just to bring a little more depth down there. And just a couple more touches. My wings were not very visible, so I have a very, very light wash of thin Snow White on my brush, my radical round. Just going to add a little more wash over those wings, and as it dries it'll become much lighter. I always worry that the camera makes it look too dark. I thought it would be fun to put a little touch of, I'm going to highlight those edges just a little bit more so they show up. Just take a look at where they need to be touched up. Not everyone does. Just a few of those. Just a little touch of plum at the base of those wings. What that's going to do is just bring a little bit of color up into those bees. Don't make their wings purple. You just want to add a hint of color. And again, a little bit of color makes a big difference, so don't overdo it. Just a soft hint. You're just reinforcing that little bit of plum. I'm going to strengthen those shadows again with soft black. Keep it very light. Everything is just very light, thin wash of paint. Doesn't take much. And I think it's looking pretty good. Just take a double take, add any highlights where they need to be. Make sure everything stands out, everything's has good contrast between the foreground and the background. You have nice shadows to make everything a little more dimensional. And I think it's looking pretty good. Add a little tiny dip dot of Snow White on those antennae, make them sparkle. Oh yeah, that's a big difference. And the reason those wings weren't showing up well is because of that background. Just need a little more contrast. Same thing up here. Those last little touches you do are often the ones that make the biggest difference. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give me a thumbs up again, subscribe. Remember, all supplies and patterns are available at www.cdwood.com. That's cover distributing. Brighten those highlights. What a difference that little bit of highlight does. And I think we're pretty much finished. Thank you for joining me. Please come back for another Create with Chris.